Okay, we want to look at absolute value equations and inequalities and how to solve those. So first thing, isolate the absolute value expression, set up two equations or inequalities, and we'll talk about what those look like, and then solve both equations for x. All right, so the absolute value expression is the expression that's in between those absolute value symbols. So to do that, we're going to want to subtract 2 from both sides. And that gives us the absolute value expression. Absolute value of x plus 5 is by itself on one side. Now, here we come up with two equations. Now, the way that absolute value works is that whatever quantity is inside the absolute value operators, we're going to take that and remove the directional aspect. So that means if it's a negative, we're going to take that off of there. So that means that x plus 5, if that's a positive number, then it's going to be that specific positive number that's 6. But if x plus 5 is a negative number, and then we took off the negative, well, that negative number would have been negative 6. All right, in either of those cases where x plus 5 is 6 or x plus 5 is negative 6, if we take the absolute value, it results in 6, which is what the equation says. So those are the two equations that we need to solve. So simple linear equations, we get x equals 1 and x equals negative 11. Two solutions. Okay, here's our next example. So remember, first thing we want to do is to isolate the absolute value expression. So that piece right there. So if we subtract 7 from both sides, we get negative 3 times the absolute value, 2x minus 1, equals a negative 6. And now we want to divide both sides by negative 3. So the negative 3's on the left will cancel, and we'll get the absolute value all by itself. And on the right side, negative 6 divided by negative 3, we get a positive 2. All right, so here's where we want to write the two equations. So first is if that inside thing, 2x minus 1, is positive, well, it's just going to be a positive 2. But if it's negative, then it's a negative 2. We can solve both those equations for x. So we get x equals 3 halves for this one, and the other one, we get x equals a negative 1/2. Okay, now let's look at absolute values with inequalities. So we've got absolute value of x plus 1 is less than or equal to 7. Okay, so I've kind of started to write the two equations. X plus 1 less than or equal to 7. That's when we're assuming that that quantity x plus 1 is positive. So it's the whole thing is less than 7. We can solve that by subtracting 1 from both sides. So we get x less than or equal to 6. All right, now if the whole quantity is negative, so we have to think about what symbol is going to go in there. It's not going to be less than or equal to negative 7. If we think about, let's put negative 7 on the number line here. Well, it's going to be, we know that it's less than or equal to positive 7 if the whole thing is positive. But if it's negative, we want to take the absolute value and get something that's less than negative 7. For that to be the case, all right, we've got to have that whole quantity x plus 1 be greater than or equal to negative 7. Okay, so we're doing two things when we have an inequality, when we write down the two equations. Okay, so for one of them, we just take the absolute value off. Okay, and we just x plus 1 less than or equal to 7. For the other one, we take the absolute value off, we change the positive number to a negative number, and then we change the inequality sign. In this case, we're going from a less than or equal to a greater than or equal to, and then solve that. So we get x, subtracting 1 from both sides, greater than or equal to negative 8. And this is an inequality that we can write with just one statement where we put x in the middle. All right, we are from here we've got x less than or equal to 6. And from the other inequality, we have that x is greater than or equal to negative 8. Or in other words, negative 8 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 6. Okay, here's another example. So for the positive case, we are going to just take off the absolute value signs and leave it as 2 minus x greater than 10. Okay, so we can kind of think, all right, this is what that looks like. For the negative case, right, we have 2 minus x, and we know we're going to have a negative 10, but whenever we take the absolute value, we want it to be greater than positive 10. So that means we want that whole quantity to be less than negative 10. Okay, so we're changing the positive to a negative, we're changing the greater than to a less than, and then solving from there. So we end up with negative 8 greater than 8 for this one, and here we end up with 12 less than x. And if we want to, we can't write that one in one inequality, all right, because we've got, if we flip this around, x is less than negative 8, and we've got x is greater than a positive 12. Both those things can't happen at the same time, but we can join those with a union symbol, and we get the solution looking like that. X is less than negative 8, union with x greater than 12.